When we usually think about global power, we picture a map, like a big physical map spread out on a table.
Right, the classic war room setup.
Exactly. And we draw these thick lines on it. We point to mountains or oceans or straits, and we say, this is where the power is. This is where history happens. It's geographic, it's concrete, and for centuries, it's been incredibly predictable. You control the high ground, you control the port, you hold the power.
Yeah, it was basically the fundamental operating system of the world. Geography was destiny. But what we're seeing now is that the physical map is becoming this wildly incomplete picture. The physical world and the digital world, they aren't running on parallel tracks anymore. They've completely collided.
And that collision is exactly what we are unpacking today, because suddenly the map isn't just mountains and oceans. It's AI data centers strategically hidden from missile ranges. It's algorithmic bias shaping global values. It's cheap commercial drones completely rewriting the economics of a superpower's military.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is. So to understand this, we are digging deep into a massive compilation from the Weekly Geopolitical Lens from July 2026. For you listening, think of this publication as like the ultimate diagnostic tool for the planet. They ignore the daily outrage cycle and just focus entirely on the structural forces, the economics, the demographics, the raw technology that are actually driving world events.
And, it is vital to point out as we jump into this that the world is currently highly polarized. We're going to be dissecting the aftermath of conflicts in the Middle East, really fierce domestic politics in the US and the UK, the ideological battlegrounds of China and Russia. The analysis we are looking at is strictly analytical, and so are we.
Right, absolutely.
We do not take sides on these political or geopolitical conflicts. Our mission today is just to neutrally report the findings, the data, and the competing arguments exactly as they're presented in the source material. We're giving you the unvarnished context so you can navigate this landscape and make up your own mind.
Perfectly said. So let's pull the lens focus right onto the epicenter of where this old world geography is crashing into new world realities, and that's the Middle East. We are looking at the massive structural fallout from the 2025 and 2026 U.S.-Israeli war with Iran.
Yeah.
The assumption in Washington, like leading up to and during that conflict, was that a massive application of military pressure would fundamentally break the Islamic Republic. The regime would just shatter under the weight of it. But the analysis from the lens indicates that the absolute inverse happened.
Well, I wouldn't say the inverse so much as an unexpected evolution.
Okay, how so?
The regime didn't collapse. It underwent this rapid, stress-tested metamorphosis. We've seen a profound generational leadership change. So with the transition to Mojtaba Khamenei and a much younger, highly militarized generation of elites, people deeply tied to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the underlying logic of the state has completely shifted.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because from the outside looking in, they're still operating within the exact same theocratic framework, right?
Yeah.
The flags are the same, the rhetoric sounds familiar, but you're saying the engine under the hood has been entirely swapped out.
Precisely. For decades, the engine of the Iranian state was ideological. The burning desire since 1979 was to export the Islamic revolution globally. This new leadership elite has essentially subordinated that revolutionary ideology to pure, pragmatic statecraft.
Wow.
Yeah, they are prioritizing state survival, military consolidation, and technocratic competence above all else. If you want a historical parallel, the analysts compare it to post-revolutionary Turkey or Kemal Abdel Nasser's Egypt in the 1950s, just a hardline nationalist, security-first state.
It's almost like, it's like watching a massively funded Silicon Valley startup that set out to, change the world completely run out of runway. So they abandon the utopian mission statement, fire the idealist, and adopt a ruthless, highly defensive corporate strategy just to ensure they don't go bankrupt. They looked at the geopolitical balance sheet and realized the revolutionary ideology was a massive liability.
That's a really sharp way to look at it, though the ideology isn't entirely gone. It's just been repurposed as a tool rather than the ultimate goal. Look at how the social contract shifted during the war. When foreign strikes hit Iranian soil, it triggered this massive, organic, nationalist reaction.
Right, rally around the flag.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Citizens who deeply opposed the theocracy still rallied around the flag because the physical homeland was under attack. The new regime leadership recognized the sheer power of that. Nationalism is a much stronger, more resilient glue right now than religious orthodoxy. So the state isn't asking its population, are you Islamic enough anymore? It is asking, are you Iranian enough?
Which is a fascinating pivot for survival. But We should be clear to anyone listening, this isn't some democratic
Not,
awakening.
not at all, no. The domestic political repression remains incredibly severe. But externally, this pragmatic confidence is manifesting in what the analysts are calling the multi-front doctrine. During the war, Iran watched Israel systematically isolate and dismantle its proxy allies one by one. The IRGC's conclusion was that they can never allow a sequential one-on-one conflict again.
Right, so the new doctrine dictates that any future engagement has to stretch their adversaries to the absolute breaking point simultaneously.
Exactly.
They are coordinating action across Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and beyond, specifically to exhaust American and Israeli missile defenses.
Yes. And because they have abandoned that ideological purity test, their diplomacy has become incredibly transactional. They have concluded that integrating with the West or finding some lasting accommodation with Washington is just a delusion. They genuinely believe the U.S. endgame is always regime change,
Yeah.
full stop. Consequently, they are pivoting hard to China.
Which makes sense from a survival standpoint.
Total sins. Beijing is now viewed as the primary long-term partner for post-war reconstruction and economic stabilization.
But they still hold one massive geographic trump card, which brings us right back to the physical map, the Strait of Hormuz.
This is where their new pragmatism becomes highly aggressive. Historically, Iran treated the strait as a panic button, right? A choke point to threaten when backed into a corner. Now, they view it as a permanent, sovereign geopolitical asset. They are trying to replace the economic benefits of Western sanctions relief by literally monetizing their geography.
Meaning what, exactly?
They have drawn up plans for a dedicated shipping hotline, structured management, and they're floating the idea of collecting transit tolls from global shipping conglomerates.
Which is an incredibly provocative move. You have U.S. President Donald Trump threatening to physically seize the strait and resume strikes if Hezbollah isn't curtailed.
Yeah.
You have Secretary of State Marco Rubio flatly rejecting any concept of transit fees. Yet, simultaneously, U.S. and Iranian officials are sitting in rooms in Switzerland, mediated by Qatar and Pakistan, holding peace talks. It's an insane diplomatic tightrope.
It is, and the shockwaves of this Iranian pivot are forcing all of their neighbors into a brutal reckoning. Take the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, the wealthy tetramonarchies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Their entire economic model for the 21st century was predicated on being these stable, glittering, hyper-modern hubs for global finance, logistics, and tourism.
And their security was predicated on the United States serving as their absolute guarantor, a faith that the recent war deeply, deeply fractured.
Exactly. The war laid bare the fragility of their diversification strategies. Now, they are trying to figure out how to operate in a baseline environment of elevated geopolitical risk, but the adaptations are wildly different depending on which border you look at. Let's examine the UAE, specifically Dubai. According to the data, they absorbed over 2,800 Iranian missile and drone strikes during the conflict.
Which is a staggering statistic. I read that number and tried to visualize it. A modern metropolis absorbing thousands of aerial strikes. But the wild part of the analysis is that daily life for the massive expat communities barely flinched. The malls were open, the traffic continued. How does a city absorb 2,800 strikes and just keep functioning like it's a normal Tuesday?
It's a combination of incredibly dense, overlapping air defense umbrellas and massive deployed financial capital. The UAE has a remarkably low break-even oil price, around $50 a barrel. This gives them a massive sovereign wealth cushion.
Right.
When the crisis hit, they didn't just rely on Patriot missiles. They deployed an economic shield. They rolled out $680 million in immediate wartime incentives, suspending hotel taxes, restaurant levies, and corporate fees to artificially keep the consumer economy buoyant. They simply subsidized their way through the panic.
So they essentially paid the market to ignore the war. That's wild.
Right.
But contrast that with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has geography on its side. It's a massive landmass, meaning its major cities were physically insulated from the worst disruptions. But they are still panicking, or at least aggressively pivoting.
They are executing what the analysts call the NEOM pivot. For years, we've seen the marketing for NEOM, this trillion-dollar futuristic luxury eco-city in the desert. The war fundamentally altered that vision. They are quietly shelving the luxury tourism elements and redesigning it as a hardened logistics and digital infrastructure hub. They're building massive AI data centers on the Red Sea coast.
Wow. And why the Red Sea coast specifically?
Because that specific coastline is 1,500 kilometers away from Iran.
They're using the desert as a physical firewall for their digital economy. It's fascinating. But not every state in the region has a $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund or endless deserts. Look at Bahrain.
Bahrain is the cautionary tale of the region right now. They are caught in a severe economic and social crisis. Their debt to GDP ratio spiked to 146%, and at the height of the crisis, they had less than 2 months of import cover.
That is terrifying.
It is. They were staring down the barrel of a junk debt downgrade and absolute economic collapse. They only survived because the UAE stepped in with a $5 billion currency swap line. And internally, the conflict dangerously inflamed tensions between the Sunni monarchy and the Shia majority, many of whom were openly sympathetic to Iran's nationalist stance.
And then there's Oman, playing an entirely different, highly dangerous game of geopolitical roulette.
Oman chose appeasement as a survival strategy. While the rest of the GCC was bracing for impact, Oman openly expressed sympathy toward Tehran. They even engaged in preliminary talks regarding Iran's proposed toll system for the Strait of Hormuz.
It worked in the short term, I guess. They avoided the missile strikes.
Yeah.
But they completely alienated their GCC allies and essentially invited the threat of secondary U.S. sanctions.
The short-term calculus versus long-term survival, yeah. But if you want to see how these localized decisions ripple across the globe, we have to look at the economic butterfly effects highlighted in the Lens report. The interconnectedness is almost surreal. You don't just see the impact of a Middle Eastern war in oil prices, you see it in the grocery store aisles in California.
Yes, the great California pistachio boom. This is one of those incredibly specific, chaotic details that makes you realize how complex the global machine is. Historically, Iran was the undisputed king of the global pistachio market, but decades of varying sanctions allowed California farmers to heavily invest to the point where the U.S. now controls about 60% of global production.
And right before the 2026 war broke out, the demand side was already going crazy because of a viral TikTok trend.
The Dubai chocolate crepe.
Yes, the Dubai chocolate craze, which featured chocolate bars stuffed with a rich green pistachio paste. Global demand spiked, pushing prices up 25%. Then the war actually hits. Iranian orchards aren't necessarily destroyed, but their shipping and export logistics are totally paralyzed. There is a sudden 31% drop in global shipments.
A result, California pistachio prices explode to $5.30 a pound by May 2026, the highest in a decade. You have roughly 950 pistachio farmers in the Central Valley of California becoming direct, immediate economic beneficiaries of a geopolitical conflict 7,000 miles away.
But the report details how unbelievably fragile that windfall is. It is already collapsing for three distinct reasons. First, the diplomatic front. If those Swiss peace talks yield an agreement, Iranian logistics will unfreeze instantly, flooding the market.
Right.
Second, the physical climate. California experienced a brutal, unseasonal spring heat wave that severely damaged the local orchards right during their natural low-yield biological cycle. Projections suggest U.S. yields will halve.
And the third factor is structural water limits.
Exactly.
California enacted strict new groundwater pumping regulations, forcing farmers to literally abandon fields because they legally cannot pull enough water from the aquifer to keep the trees alive. So you have this massive geopolitical windfall erased almost immediately by the realities of a changing physical climate and local regulations.
It's a perfect microcosm of modern supply chain fragility. And speaking of supply chains, the analysis points to another, even larger economic anomaly from this period: global oil prices. You have a massive, sustained war involving Iran, the Gulf states, and the U.S. Historically, that guarantees a massive spike in crude oil. Yet Brent crude actually dropped below $73 a barrel, reverting to pre-war levels.
I was reading this thinking, how is that mathematically possible? The entire region is on fire.
It's possible because of a quiet, massive structural shift happening in China. During the peak of the conflict, Chinese oil imports plummeted by 4.7 million barrels per day. That is a gargantuan volume of energy just removed from the demand column.
How does the world's industrial engine just turn off the tap to that degree?
The analysts attribute it to three converging trends. The first is the sheer velocity of their electric vehicle transition. Rapid EV adoption in China displaced nearly 670,000 barrels of oil demand every single day.
Wow.
Second, a massive efficiency leap in their plastics industry. Chinese refiners aggressively pivoted from producing combustible fuels to advanced polymers and chemicals, refining processes so efficiently that they shaved off over 1 million barrels a day of raw crude demand.
And the third piece is the strategic reserve game.
Exactly. For years, China was purposefully over-importing, buying far more oil than it consumed to quietly top off its massive strategic petroleum reserves. Last month, they flipped the switch. Instead of buying at high wartime prices, they just stopped importing and started drawing down those reserves. They single-handedly neutralized the geopolitical premium on oil.
Which brings us back to the region itself. We've covered the economics and the Iranian evolution, but the political ground in Israel is moving just as fast. The prolonged nature of this conflict and the trauma of the last few years is fundamentally rewriting Israeli domestic politics.
It really is. The era of Benjamin Netanyahu is facing an existential electoral threat. The latest polling data shows Gadi Eisenkot leading a new centrist coalition, not just overtaking rivals like Naftali Bennett, but actively rivaling Netanyahu's Likud party.
And Eisenkot is a complex figure. He fits the archetype of what the Israeli electorate often seeks during moments of deep crisis, which is an unassailable security resume. He's a former chief of general staff for the IDF, but because he only entered the Knesset in 2022, he is viewed as untainted by the decades of political gridlock and scandal that defines much of the establishment.
He is incredibly difficult to pigeonhole ideologically, which might be his greatest asset right now. If you look at his military history, he is the architect of the Dahiya Doctrine.
Right.
This is a highly controversial, incredibly aggressive military strategy formulated after the 2006 Lebanon War. It essentially argues that in an asymmetric war, the IDF should use disproportionate force and target civilian infrastructure that harbors militant strongholds to create overwhelming deterrence.
Right, it's a doctrine of profound destruction. But then you look at his tenure as IDF chief around 2015 and 2016 during a wave of knife attacks, and he fiercely, publicly opposed a blanket shoot-to-kill policy against Palestinian attackers. He argued it corrupted the moral core of the military. He took massive heat from the right-wing establishment for that.
That contradiction is exactly what appeals to the current exhausted electorate. He projects absolute military lethality combined with a strict adherence to institutional boundaries. But what propelled his current surge was his highly public, very bitter resignation from Netanyahu's emergency war cabinet. He joined immediately after October 7th, but left 8 months later, issuing a searing critique of Netanyahu's leadership.
He warned that Israel was being dragged into an endless, inconclusive war. He stated clearly that total military dismantling of Hamas in Gaza was an illusion without a viable political strategy to fill the vacuum.
And the analysts note that 2 years later, his warnings have largely materialized. The IDF occupies vast swaths of Gaza, yet Hamas remains an entrenched insurgent force. The human toll is staggering: over 73,000 lives lost, the vast majority being civilians. The infrastructure of Gaza is completely leveled, and the diplomatic cost has been a profound fracturing of Israel's relationship with Washington.
And we absolutely cannot ignore the deep, tragic personal resonance Eisenkot carries. He isn't just offering white paper critiques. His own 25-year-old son, Gal, was killed in combat in Gaza just 2 months before Eisenkot resigned from the cabinet. When Eisenkot speaks to the Israeli public about the unbearable costs of an endless war, it possesses a gravity that standard political rhetoric simply cannot touch.
Which is precisely why his platform is resonating. He is campaigning on a total rejection of Netanyahu's grand, often theatrical promises to redraw the map of the Middle East. Eisenkot labels that rhetoric as dangerous fantasy driven by Netanyahu's desperate need for political self-preservation. Eisenkot wants to capitalize on immediate diplomatic off-ramps. He wants to end the kinetic wars so the state can focus on severe internal crises, constitutional balance, the role of religion in the state, and basic economic security.
The sources describe him as a grim, serious technocrat. He's not a charismatic orator. He speaks halting English. He doesn't do slick media hits. But after years of high drama, high rhetoric politics, the voters seem desperate for a grim technocrat.
But Eisenkot's core military critique, that massive, overwhelming force is failing to achieve traditional victory, is actually part of a much larger global paradigm shift. This conflict has illuminated a terrifying reality for the established powers. The very nature of how wars are fought and what technology wins them has changed.
This transitions us perfectly into a brilliant piece of analysis in our stack by Paul Scharr from Foreign Affairs. His central thesis should be setting off alarm bells in the Pentagon. He argues that the United States is rapidly losing its traditional technological military edge. For the last 50 years, the American theory of warfare was simple. Possess the most exquisite, incredibly expensive, highly advanced platforms on Earth.
Right.
You build $1 billion stealth bomber, you blanket the Earth in GPS, you develop hyper-precision munitions, and absolutely nobody can touch you.
But Shar's data suggests that era is definitively over. We have crossed the threshold into the era of cheap autonomous mass. The technological advantages that underpinned American dominance, stealth, precision networking are eroding because the new foundational technologies like artificial intelligence, commercial drone components, and satellite imagery cannot be monopolized by a single government. They are commercially available, easily duplicated, and spread instantaneously.
Let's look at the sheer numbers, because they break the traditional economic models of war. During the recent conflict, Iran launched over 2,200 ballistic and cruise missiles, alongside roughly 4,400 attack drones. They use massive swarms of relatively cheap technology to overwhelm, exhaust, and occasionally penetrate incredibly expensive, highly advanced U.S. and allied radar and defense systems.
And that dynamic is even more pronounced in Ukraine. The report highlights that Ukraine's defense sector is currently producing roughly 4 million drones annually. 4 million.
That's insane.
By stark contrast, the massive, highly funded U.S. Army procurement system currently acquires only about 50,000 drones a year. It is a catastrophic failure of industrial scale and adaptation.
So let's dig into the economic asymmetry here. Let's say you have an adversarial drone that costs maybe $2,000 or $3,000 to assemble from commercial parts. To defend against it, the U.S. military launches a Patriot missile. What is the actual math on that exchange?
The math is disastrous. A single Patriot interceptor missile costs anywhere from $2 to $4 million.
You are spending $4 million to destroy $3,000. You don't even need to defeat the U.S. military on the battlefield. You just need to force them to defend themselves until you bankrupt their defense budget. The economic logic of the U.S. military is completely inverted.
Exactly. And Shar makes another critical point about visibility. The battlefield is now completely transparent. Because of persistent, cheap surveillance drones buzzing everywhere, 24 hours a day, the concept of surprise or concealment is dead. You cannot mass troops or hide armor. In the Ukraine theater, drones are now responsible for more casualties than traditional artillery. Survival now requires mass production, disposability, and sheer quantity, rather than a handful of highly sophisticated, irreplaceable platforms.
I'm looking at this analysis, and a massive contradiction jumps out at me. The United States is the undisputed global heavyweight champion of artificial intelligence research. Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, Meta, they're all American. Most of the top AI talent is in California. So if the future of warfare is fundamentally about AI and autonomous drone swarms, shouldn't Silicon Valley give the U.S. military an unassailable advantage? Why are they losing the war of technology?
Because, as Shar points out, possessing the technology is completely different from implementing it. The bottleneck isn't invention, it is adoption. The Pentagon's bureaucracy is a relic of the Cold War. It is designed to spend 10 years designing and procuring a single fighter jet. But AI models and drone technologies update every 3 to 6 months. The procurement system simply cannot ingest technology at that speed.
The historical analogy the sources use here is fantastic. They compare it to the world's greatest navies in the 19th century, resisting steam-powered ships because their entire culture and promotion system was built around sails. Or cavalry's resisting tanks because a tank isn't a horse. The U.S. Air Force is institutionally reluctant to fully embrace entirely autonomous drone swarms because their identity, their culture, and their leadership structure revolve around human fighter pilots.
History tells us repeatedly that rival militaries often possess roughly the same underlying technology at the start of a conflict. What actually determines the victor is doctrine, organizational flexibility, and the speed of adaptation. The Spanish Armada had spectacular ships and technology, but they utterly failed to adapt their naval tactics and were destroyed by the English. Shar argues that the U.S. is currently stumbling toward its own Spanish Armada moment.
And you can see this institutional friction boiling over into open conflict right now. The lens notes a massive, unprecedented shakeup in U.S. military leadership. General Chris Donahue, the top U.S. commander in Europe, just abruptly resigned. And he didn't just retire. He left amidst a sweeping purge of senior military brass being driven by the new Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, who is aggressively trying to dismantle that very bureaucracy.
The disruption is visceral. Shar concludes that going forward, we have to completely change how we measure military power. You can't just count the number of aircraft carriers or tanks a nation has. You have to measure their raw computing power, their sovereign GPU capacity, and the speed at which their military can push AI software updates to frontline units. Computing power is the new coal, the new oil. It is the fundamental strategic resource.
Which naturally makes me think of the other superpower. We are constantly inundated with alarmist narratives about China's massive military modernization. specifically the idea that they are building an unstoppable force designed to cross the strait and invade Taiwan. But our next source, an analysis by Dennis Blair, calls this the mirage of China's military edge.
Blair's argument is that Western panic over Taiwan is actually counterproductive. It encourages Chinese overconfidence and undermines the very real deterrence that currently exists. His central thesis is that while China's People's Liberation Army, the PLA, has modernized at a terrifying speed, they still fundamentally lack the very specific capabilities required to successfully conquer, occupy, and pacify Taiwan.
Let's complicate that a bit, though, because on paper, China now possesses the largest navy in the world by sheer ship count. How can they have the biggest navy but lack the capability to cross a 100-mile strait?
It comes down to exactly what they built. Blair points out that China invested heavily in building a formidable global blue water navy. They built aircraft carriers, advanced destroyers, and long-range anti-ship missiles. They built a navy designed to project power into the deep Pacific and keep the U.S. Navy far away from their coastlines. What they did not build is a massive, dedicated amphibious invasion force.
So they have the ships to fight a majestic naval battle in the open ocean, but they don't have the heavy landing craft, the troop transports, or the close-in naval gunfire support required to actually drop 500,000 soldiers onto the heavily fortified mountainous beaches of Taiwan.
Precisely. And in military science, amphibious invasions against a prepared adversary are universally considered the most complex, disastrously difficult operations to execute. The PLA has absolutely zero modern combat experience in this arena. Furthermore, their joint command structure is still heavily dominated by army generals, whereas the Taiwan scenario requires seamless, unprecedented coordination between naval, air, and cyber domains.
I always see these think tank war games in the news, these highly publicized simulations that invariably show the U.S. and Taiwan losing quickly. Are those just entirely flawed?
Blair argues they are often highly skewed. Public simulations tend to rely on incomplete, unclassified information. They frequently maximize the assumed effectiveness of untested Chinese missile forces while minimizing the resilience of U.S. and Taiwanese countermeasures. Blair notes that deeply classified Pentagon simulations consistently show that while China can inflict horrific, devastating losses, they ultimately cannot sustain the logistics to conquer and hold the island.
Because that same economic asymmetry we talked about with drones now heavily favors Taiwan as the defender. Taiwan increased its defense spending to a record $18 billion. They aren't trying to match China ship for ship. They are stockpiling tens of thousands of cheap drones, advanced cyber weapons, and mobile anti-ship missiles. If China tries to slowly move massive, expensive amphibious landing ships across the strait, they become floating targets for swarms of $2,000 Taiwanese drones.
Exactly. The era of cheap mass empowers the defender. And beyond the military tactical nightmare, the economic cost of Beijing would be suicidal. If they attempt a blockade or a quick decapitation strike, it triggers immediate, crippling global sanctions. More importantly, it would likely result in the interdiction of their maritime energy imports, which they desperately rely on to keep their economy running.
So Blair's ultimate takeaway is that deterrence is actually holding. The technological and economic trends favor Taiwan and the U.S. alliance in the Pacific.
Yes, the real danger isn't an inevitable Chinese military victory. The danger is a tragic miscalculation caused by Western defeatism or Chinese arrogance.
Speaking of economic endurance during conflict, we have to look at the third piece of this global battlefield puzzle, and that's Russia. For years, the dominant narrative in Western capitals was that the crushing weight of unprecedented economic sanctions would completely collapse the Russian economy and force an end to their war effort. But the data from the geopolitical lens paints a very different, very stubborn reality.
The Russian economy has stubbornly refused to collapse. There was a brief moment of Western optimism early in 2026 when official statistics showed the Russian GDP shrank by 0.2% in the first quarter. Analysts jumped on it, claiming the recession had finally arrived, but the Lens report dissects that data and calls it a statistical mirage.
How does a GDP contraction turn out to be a mirage?
It was an anomaly caused entirely by domestic tax policy, not structural failure. In late 2025, the Russian government announced they were raising the VAT, the value-added tax, from 20% to 22%, effective January 1st, 2026.
Okay, basic human psychology. If I know everything's going to be 2% more expensive next month, I'm going to buy my big-ticket items right now.
Exactly. Consumers front-loaded massive amounts of spending into November and December of 2025 to beat the tax hike. That created an artificial spike in Q4, which inevitably led to a massive hangover and drop in spending in Q1 of 2026. When economists smooth out that tax-induced volatility and look at real-time alternative indicators, the Russian economy is actually growing at a slow but stable rate of about 1%.
The internal microeconomic metrics are wild. Unemployment is practically non-existent, locked at a record low of 2%. Because the military and defense factories are sucking up all the labor, employers have to pay a massive premium to keep workers. Real wages are reportedly up 25% compared to 2019 levels. And my absolute favorite grim detail luxury black market imports are soaring. Lamborghini sales inside Russia are up 80% year over year.
That specific detail tells you that the Russian elite have completely adapted to the sanctions regime. They have established sophisticated gray market supply chains through third countries to get whatever they want. Now, the macro picture isn't entirely rosy. They are spending roughly 7 to 8% of their entire GDP on the military, which is incredibly high.
Right.
But the analysts emphasize it as a manageable burden. The government still has deep reserves. They can marginally raise taxes. They can slowly draw down sovereign wealth funds. They can issue more domestic debt, or they can simply force large corporations to hand over deposits.
So the sobering conclusion is that the Russian war economy is just trundling along. It has reached a steady state of perpetual mobilization, and short of a catastrophic collapse in global oil prices, they can sustain this indefinitely.
Which brings us to the underlying engine driving so much of this geopolitical anxiety. Whether we are talking about military procurement in Washington, economic survival in the Gulf, or tech dominance in the Pacific, it all revolves around the artificial intelligence race. This isn't just a tech story anymore. It is the foundational geopolitical battleground of our time.
And this is where the balance of power just experienced a massive, unexpected tremor. In June 2026, a relatively quiet Beijing-based lab called ZPU released an AI model called GLM 5.2. According to rigorous independent analysis, this is now the smartest open-source model available on the planet. It definitively beat Google's Gemini on standard benchmarks and is trailing only slightly behind the absolute apex models from OpenAI.
This development fundamentally terrified U.S. policymakers. The entire American strategy for the last 3 years was built on the assumption that strict export controls on advanced microchips would act as a physical bottleneck, keeping Chinese AI labs years behind Silicon Valley.
But it turns out, export controls are just speed bumps, not roadblocks.
Yeah.
Chinese engineers bypass the hardware limitations through incredibly clever software workarounds. They heavily utilize post-training enhancements and a technique called distillation.
Let's explain distillation because it's crucial. It essentially means Chinese labs are taking the highly refined, brilliant outputs from American AIs and feeding them into their own models as training data. They are effectively using American computational power to teach their own systems how to think.
But the Lens report highlights a massive caveat to China's rapid rise here, something they call the efficiency trap. And I want to make sure I understand this correctly. On paper, the Chinese models are heavily undercutting Western tech on price. A Chinese company like DeepSeek charges roughly 87 cents per 1 million output tokens, while Anthropic charges closer to $50. It looks like China is going to destroy American tech on sheer economics.
It looks that way until you look at the mechanics of how the models operate. Large language models process and generate information in tokens, which are essentially fragments of words or code. When you give a top-tier American model a complex software engineering problem, it solves it efficiently, using a concise number of tokens. When you give the exact same problem to a Chinese model like DeepSeek, it struggles. To reach the correct answer, the Chinese model has to churn through up to 23 times more thinking tokens.
It's like hiring a taxi. The Chinese taxi advertises an incredibly cheap rate per mile. But to get you to your destination, the driver takes a convoluted, wildly inefficient route that is 23 times longer than the American taxi. So when you get to the end of the ride, the total bill is actually higher, and it took way more time.
That is a brilliant analogy. Independent benchmarking confirmed exactly that. When applied to real-world complex software engineering tasks, utilizing the Chinese GLM 5.2 ultimately cost companies more overall in raw compute time than using the equivalent supposedly more expensive American systems. Additionally, analysts suspect Chinese labs are aggressively teaching to the test, optimizing their models specifically to score highly on known public benchmarks, while their performance degrades on novel unreleased tests.
Okay, so the American tech is still functionally superior, but China is executing a brilliant geopolitical flanking maneuver with this technology. They are weaponizing the concept of radical openness.
This is a direct, calculated response to American overreach. Recently, the U.S. government, citing national security concerns, forced Anthropic to ban all non-American users from accessing their top-tier model, Fable 5. They just flipped a switch and cut off the world.
which sent a shockwave of panic through global businesses. If you are a bank in Brazil or a logistics company in Indonesia, you suddenly realize your entire digital infrastructure can be turned off on a whim by a politician in Washington.
Exactly. And into that panic steps Beijing. They released GLM 5.2 as an open weight model. This means anyone, anywhere in the world can download the actual core architecture of the AI, inspect the code, and run it locally on their own servers. It is completely immune to American censorship or sanctions. China is aggressively positioning its AI architecture as the reliable, sovereign alternative for the entire developing world.
But that raises a much deeper, almost philosophical question that the report dives into. If the developing world adopts Chinese AI, what worldview are they actually importing? Because we tend to think of computers as these cold, neutral calculators. But generative AI is entirely different. AI models are cultural artifacts. They absorb, encode, and reflect the political and moral norms embedded in the billions of pages of human text they are trained on.
This is perhaps the most insidious, invisible geopolitical force operating today. An investigation by the economists cross-referenced the outputs of major AI models with the world values, survey a global metric of human beliefs. The results were startling. Western frontier models heavily, almost exclusively, align with the cultural norms of rich, secular Western democracies. OpenAI's models, for instance, register as significantly more secular than any actual physical nation on Earth. Google's Gemini places an almost unprecedented hyper-American emphasis on individual freedoms compared to the global human average.
And when researchers tested them specifically on American political axes, virtually all major Western models exhibited a clear American Democrat bias. They lean heavily toward progressive social policies, and it's incredibly difficult to scrub out. The report notes that even Elon Musk's model Grok, which was explicitly engineered and marketed to be anti-woke, still registers as socially liberal in its outputs, despite being economically centrist.
It happens because the training data itself, the internet, academia, media, leans that way. To prove how deeply the data dictates the worldview, researchers conducted a fascinating experiment. They trained a model called Talkie exclusively on texts, books, and articles written before the year 1931.
The resulting AI was essentially a Victorian conservative. It aggressively valued God, strict law and order, traditional hierarchies, and the glory of the British Empire above all else. It proves the AI is just a mirror of its diet. So what happens when we look in the mirror of the Chinese models?
This is where the engineering enters a very dystopian realm. Technical inspections of open-weight Chinese AIs reveal what researchers call an internal monologue. Because these models must ingest vast amounts of global data to achieve high intelligence, the base models actually know historical truths. If you dig deep into their architecture, they know the facts about the Tiananmen Square massacre, for example.
But if a user in Nairobi asks the chatbot about Tiananmen Square, it doesn't tell the truth.
No, because the developers construct a secondary post-training censorship layer. It is essentially a digital commissar that sits on top of the AI. It constantly monitors the model's internal thoughts, and if it detects any output that contradicts Chinese Communist Party doctrine or admits to government misconduct, it intercepts and suppresses the answer, replacing it with a deflected or propagandized response. It possesses the truth, but it is explicitly programmed to lie.
And Western security officials are terrified that as these cheap, heavily subsidized Chinese models flood the global South powering customer service, education, and government administration in Africa and South America, they will quietly, implicitly project this distorted, authoritarian-friendly worldview to billions of cost-conscious users.
Which is sparking a global demand for sovereign AI. People are realizing they don't want to be forced into a binary choice between Western secular liberalism and Chinese state censorship. Developers are racing to build custom ecosystems. A prime example mentioned in the sources is Ansari, a specialized Islamic chatbot explicitly trained and fine-tuned to guide users and offer advice strictly within the framework of Quranic values and Islamic jurisprudence.
It feels like we're asking software programmers to write code that solves the ultimate problems of human morality. A 24-year-old computer science grad isn't equipped to solve the trolley problem, let alone program it into a machine.
And the tech companies have finally realized that, which explains one of the most surprising data points in this entire compilation: the sudden, massive hiring spree for philosophers. Right now, the unemployment rate for philosophy graduates has plummeted to 5.1%, which is actually lower than the 7% unemployment rate for computer science graduates. The people who study code are worried about losing their jobs to automation, while the people who study Aristotle are getting bidding wars in Silicon Valley.
It's incredible, because the problems at the frontier of AI are no longer technical. They are deeply ethical and conceptual. How do you mathematically define truthfulness? How do you weigh competing moral values when an AI gives medical advice? Code cannot answer that.
The sources outline how philosophers are practically changing AI architecture. One major avenue is the application of the Socratic method. Early chatbots were sycophants. They would just blindly agree with whatever premise the user presented, which led to massive hallucinations. The AI confidently inventing fake information just to please the user. Philosophers are training the models to engage in Socratic dialogue, to ask probing questions, identify logical contradictions in the user's prompts, and most importantly, practice Socratic ignorance, teaching the machine to recognize the boundaries of its own knowledge and comfortably state, "I do not know."
But the most profound impact is in the realm of AI alignment, specifically through something called constitutional AI. Anthropic's model, Claude, is the pioneer here. Instead of relying on thousands of gig workers in developing countries to click thumbs up or thumbs down on the AI's answers to train its behavior, they gave the AI an explicit, written ethical constitution to govern itself.
And that constitution is a fascinating, bizarre amalgamation of human thought. It draws principles from Immanuel Kant, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, non-Western philosophical traditions, and Apple's terms of service. It's an engineered soul.
And these resident philosophers have to decide which foundational ethical framework to apply based on the AI's intended use case. They're debating between deontology and consequentialism.
Let's define those for the context of AI. Deontology is rule-based ethics. It argues that certain actions are inherently right or wrong, regardless of the consequences. Do not lie, do not deceive, respect human autonomy. This is the perfect framework for a digital assistant or a customer service chatbot. You want it bound by strict, unbreakable rules of honesty. Anthropic's Claude leans heavily toward this deontological approach.
But if you apply strict rules to an AI operating in the messy, physical world, it fails. That's where consequentialism comes in. Consequentialism judges the morality of an action strictly by its outcome, creating the greatest good for the greatest number.
Exactly. If you have an AI driving a physical car and a crash is mathematically unavoidable, it cannot rely on a rule that says do no harm, because harm is guaranteed. It must use consequentialist logic to calculate the trajectory that minimizes the total loss of life. The exact same logic applies to military targeting AI, weighing operational value against civilian casualties.
It is staggering to think that debates held in glass offices in California over 18th century philosophy are being hard-coded into systems that will eventually dictate life or death decisions on our roads and battlefields.
It raises a profound concern the authors call moral deskilling. If we outsource our complex ethical judgments to algorithms, whether it's screening resumes, approving loans, or targeting weapons, we risk atrophying our own human capacity for moral reasoning.
And while the philosophers debate the moral future, the average worker is staring down the barrel of immediate, brutal economic disruption. The paradox of the AI revolution is that it promises unfathomable macroeconomic wealth while threatening devastating microeconomic destruction.
The macro numbers are astonishing. The analysis projects that widespread AI adoption could generate an additional $6.4 trillion in annual economic value for the U.S. alone by 2030. To capture that, the major tech hyperscalers Google, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft are boosting their capital spending by an unbelievable 77%, laying out $725 billion just to build the data centers and energy infrastructure required to run these models.
But the human cost of that transition is hitting a highly specific, very vocal demographic. The economists are calling it the AI shock. And we have to contrast this with the last major economic disruption, the China shock of the early 2000s. When global trade opened up, the China shock hollowed out physical manufacturing. It disproportionately devastated older blue-collar workers in specific geographic regions, like the American Rust Belt or the north of England.
The AI shock is the exact inverse. It is highly concentrated on young, highly educated, white-collar professionals regardless of geography. Software engineers, management consultants, entry-level lawyers, accountants, and the velocity of the shock is entirely different. You can't build a massive physical factory overnight, but you can deploy a digital AI agent to 100 million computers in a weekend. The displacement is immediate.
And the data is already showing the cracks. In March 2026, the jobless rate for recent college graduates hit 5.6%, which is significantly higher than the overall national average. You have an entire generation of Gen Z workers who already feel locked out of the housing market, suddenly realizing that their expensive, elite college degree offers absolutely no protection because a chatbot can draft a legal brief or write a Python script faster, cheaper, and without needing health insurance.
Policy experts are terrified of the political implications. If you suddenly have millions of highly educated, deeply indebted, profoundly angry young people facing structural unemployment, it is the perfect recipe for a massive, radicalized political backlash. The fear is they will demand draconian regulations that stifle AI development, which would cause the U.S. to lose the geopolitical productivity race to China.
To preempt that, a policy paper by James Davidson and Matthew Slaughter proposes a radical three-pronged playbook. The first prong is aimed right at the tech giants, a 25% equity compensation tax.
The logic is that the financial gains of AI are accruing almost entirely to the stock valuations of a few mega-cap tech companies. The executives and top engineers are paid heavily in stock. The authors propose a 25% federal payroll tax specifically on that equity compensation. They calculate it would generate roughly $100 billion annually. To the tech giants, that's a fraction of their multi-trillion-dollar market caps. But to the government, it is a massive fund designed to finance a new social safety net.
And what does that safety net look like? Prongs 2 and 3. Portable tax credits and wage loss insurance. The tax credits are designed for lifelong upskilling. Instead of relying on slow, outdated government retraining centers, workers get direct financial credits to buy their own specialized retraining in the private market.
But the critical stabilization tool is wage loss insurance. Imagine a 28-year-old software engineer earning $120,000 whose coding job is automated. They have a mortgage. If they have to take an entry-level job in a new AI-resistant field making $60,000, they face financial ruin. Wage loss insurance would step in and temporarily replace a significant fraction of that lost income, cushioning the fall. It prevents personal bankruptcy and incentivizes them to get back into the workforce quickly rather than holding out for a high-paying job that no longer exists.
But while policymakers debate white papers, the corporate reality is moving at warp speed, and the lens provides a rapid-fire look at how chaotic the tech markets are right now. The divergence between winners and losers is violent.
Look at SpaceX. They finally executed their highly anticipated IPO in June 2026. The stock surged initially and then suffered a catastrophic collapse, wiping $400 billion off its market valuation in a single trading session. It was the second largest single-day loss in corporate history. The financial strain was so severe they had to immediately launch a $25 billion jump bond offering just to restructure loans that Elon Musk had used to cross-collateralize his other ventures.
Yeah, and while the space sector bled, the hardware layer of AI is minting fortunes. Micron, a major chip maker, reported revenue up 345%, with net profits surging a staggering 1,400% year over year. The companies selling the digital pickaxes for the AI gold rush are defying gravity.
We're also seeing legacy companies desperately trying to survive by feeding the AI machine. Getty Images, which was facing existential irrelevance, saved its stock price by signing a massive direct partnership with OpenAI to supply its entire visual library as training data. Meanwhile, Oracle announced the termination of 21,000 global jobs, explicitly stating in their regulatory filings that AI agents had fully supplanted those human roles. JD.com, the Chinese e-commerce titan, publicly predicted that within a decade, autonomous robots will replace its entire fleet of 700,000 delivery drivers.
And then there's a headline that feels like it was ripped straight from a sci-fi novel. A legal first in the UK. An entirely AI-driven law firm operating under the name Garfield AI successfully prepared, filed, and won a commercial contract recovery case in an English court.
And look at the economics of that case. The human client spent a total of £400 on AI computing fees to win a £7,000 judgment. A human barrister was required to physically stand up in the courtroom and read the statements, but the AI conducted all the legal research, drafted the arguments, and prepared the filings. The disruption of the elite professions is no longer theoretical, it has arrived in the courtroom.
And this technological disruption isn't confined to the economy. It is fracturing the social foundation of the next generation. How does a society govern a generation whose entire reality, self-worth, and social interaction is mediated by these hyper-optimized algorithms? This brings us to a massive global policy shift detailed in the report. The aggressive legislative crackdown on social media for minors.
Australia is the vanguard here. Following years of intense, highly organized public campaigns from parents and pediatricians terrified of skyrocketing cyberbullying, body dysmorphia, and youth mental health crises, the Australian government took the nuclear option. They enacted a nationwide hard ban on social media access for anyone under the age of 16.
The mechanism of how they did this is crucial. They didn't criminalize the teenagers, and they didn't put the onus on the parents. They placed the entire legal and technological burden squarely on the tech platforms. Instagram, TikTok, X. They legally must prove they're actively blocking underage users from the platform, or face devastating fines of up to £26 million per breach.
When the law went into effect, the immediate impact was massive. The platforms, terrified of the liability, aggressively deactivated 4.7 million accounts belonging to young Australians. However, the debate immediately shifted to the efficacy of the ban. A few months later, independent polling revealed that 61% of the targeted 12 to 15-year-old demographic had managed to bypass the ban and maintain active accounts.
Right, because teenagers are infinitely more tech-savvy than regulators. They use VPNs to spoof their location, they exploit loopholes in age verification software, or their parents simply surrender and create the accounts under their own names. The tech lobby immediately seized on the 61% Asian rate, went to the press, and declared the entire policy a catastrophic, unenforceable failure.
But the proponents of the ban look at that exact same data and claim a massive victory.
And honestly, I agree with the proponents here. If 61% bypassed it, that means 39% of young teenagers are completely off the platforms. Think about a highway speed limit. If the speed limit is 65 miles an hour, and 60% of the people drive 75 miles an hour, we don't declare the concept of speed limits a failure and abolish them. The speed limit still drastically slows down the overall flow of traffic, reduces fatalities, and establishes a baseline expectation of safety. Isn't a 39% reduction in exposure to toxic algorithms a massive public health win?
That is precisely the sociological argument. It is about shifting cultural norms and creating a friction barrier. Polling shows that 59% of Australian adults view the policy as reasonably effective at establishing a new societal boundary, and that momentum is highly contagious. The UK, under Prime Minister Keir Starmer, immediately announced an Australia Plus plan slated for 2027.
The UK plan goes even further into the behavioral weeds. They aren't just looking at age gates. They are proposing restricting 16 and 17-year-olds from accessing highly sexualized AI companion chatbots. They are seriously exploring legislation to mandate digital curfews, forcing platforms to lock out teenage accounts from midnight to 6 a.m. to protect sleep cycles, and outright banning behavioral hooks like infinite scrolling.
But the Lens analysts point out that opponents raise deeply valid, unintended consequences. Online child safety charities warn of a dangerous migration effect. If you successfully kick teenagers off heavily regulated, publicly visible mainstream platforms, their desire for digital connection doesn't evaporate. They migrate into unmonitored, end-to-end encrypted messaging apps or darker, unregulated corners of the internet where predation is significantly harder to track. Furthermore, over half the teens surveyed reported a massive drop in their ability to access civic information or news because social media is their primary news infrastructure.
And there's the corporate liability loophole. If a tech company can legally say, hey, we banned everyone under 16, they can wash their hands of any fundamental responsibility to redesign their platforms to be inherently safer or less addictive for the vulnerable populations that remain on them. It's a regulatory band-aid over a structural wound.
It is a profoundly complex regulatory knot. And as governments struggle to regulate the digital lives of their citizens, their traditional physical political systems are buckling under the strain of all these intersecting crises. As we look at the global political landscape, the overarching theme is exhaustion and fracture.
Let's start with a milestone that exemplifies that exhaustion. The UK is currently marking the 10-year anniversary of the 2016 Brexit referendum. And regardless of where you stand on the issue, the political reality a decade later is defined by a bitter stalemate between regret over leaving, and profound Brexit fatigue.
Applying our mandate to neutrally report the data, the economic critics of Brexit point to a grim ledger. Deep economic analyses estimate that the UK's GDP is up to 8% lower than it would have been had they remained integrated in the EU. In real terms, they calculate that equates to an annual loss of over £3,300 per person. Business investment remains severely depressed, down 12%. Critics argue the UK isolated itself, voluntarily exited the world's largest single market, and drastically diminished its geopolitical influence. Polling consistently suggests that a clear majority of the public now supports rejoining.
On the flip side, the ardent supporters of the project highlight that the apocalyptic predictions peddled in 2016 immediate catastrophic recession and financial sector collapse simply never materialized. The UK economy continued to grow and actually hit record employment levels between 2016 and 2020. They attribute the recent economic sluggishness entirely to global external shocks, the massive debt incurred during COVID-19, the energy price spikes from the Ukraine war, and the heavy costs of the net zero climate transition.
And their core argument remains rooted in sovereignty. Supporters point to tangible policy divergence that would have been legally impossible inside the EU framework. Britain protected its domestic steel industry with targeted tariffs, slashed tariffs on imported agricultural goods to lower food prices, aggressively improved the commercial use of gene-edited crops to boost farming yields, and notably imposed VAT on private school fees. They argue the mechanism of state control was successfully repatriated to London.
The objective analysts at the Lens suggest the reality is a messy middle. The UK unquestionably secured greater regulatory flexibility. They're currently maneuvering to be much more agile in regulating AI than the heavy-handed EU, for example. But successive Conservative and Labour governments completely failed to implement the radical, sweeping deregulation that the original Brexit architects envisioned. Meanwhile, the daily reality for British businesses, exporting goods, navigating border checks, securing labor, is undeniably permanently more bureaucratic.
But the most striking political takeaway from the anniversary isn't the data, it's the silence. The country is completely exhausted by the debate. Even political factions that historically campaigned to rejoin the EU are actively avoiding the topic. The Liberal Democrats quietly postponed their conference calls to rejoin the single market. Fatigue has completely overpowered regret.
And that profound fatigue is manifesting in incredible political instability. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer just abruptly announced his resignation less than 2 years after securing a historic landslide victory. His tenure was instantly derailed by internal party civil wars, broken economic promises, and a series of inappropriate behavior scandals. He was ultimately forced out following a massive by-election victory by a rival faction led by Andy Burnham. The dysfunction is so acute that the EU literally postponed a highly anticipated reset summit because they don't know who is actually running the British government.
And this political roulette, driven by economic anxiety and technological disruption, is playing out globally. In the United States, basic governance is paralyzed. A major bipartisan housing bill designed to drastically lower construction costs and ease inflation is completely stalled. Why? Because President Trump is refusing to sign any legislation until Congress passes his highly controversial election reform bill. Meanwhile, at the local level, left-wing Democratic Socialists in New York just successfully unseated deeply entrenched establishment incumbents, riding a wave of populist anger aligned with Mayor Zoran Mamdani.
The unrest spans the globe. Latin America is experiencing a massive reactionary swing to the right, driven by voter fury over inflation and cartel violence. In Colombia, the conservative hardliner Abelardo de la Espriella just defeated the leftist Senator Iván Cepeda by less than a 1% margin. In Peru, the right-leaning Keiko Fujimori has built an insurmountable lead ahead of their elections.
In Europe, Hungary is experiencing a political earthquake. The new centrist Prime Minister, Peter Magyar, launched a sweeping initiative called Operation Cleansing Fire, aiming to systematically root out deep state corruption and amend the constitution to permanently oust the entrenched allies of former leader Viktor Orban.
And the youth bulge in developing nations is turning volatile. In India, a massive youth-led movement, ironically calling themselves the Cockroach Janta Party, is paralyzing cities with protests after systemic medical exam leaks forced 2.2 million students to retake their tests, shattering faith in meritocracy. And Bolivia is currently in a declared state of emergency due to crippling anti-austerity roadblocks cutting off major cities.
The human political system is running incredibly hot. But we must conclude our analysis by looking at the physical planet, which is quite literally running hotter, acting as a massive threat multiplier for every single political and economic crisis we just discussed.
The climate data on Europe is genuinely shocking. When we discuss climate vulnerability, the narrative usually focuses on the global south, island nations, or desertification in Africa. But the data shows Europe is actually the fastest warming continent on the planet. It is warming at an astonishing 0.56 degrees Celsius per decade, which is exactly double the global average.
And the consequences this summer were lethal. Europe endured a historically brutal heat wave. France recorded a staggering 44.3 degrees Celsius, that is 111.7 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat crippled public transit infrastructure, buckled rail lines, and caused at least 48 drowning deaths as people desperately sought relief. In a darkly ironic twist, a major international Climate Action Week summit scheduled in London had to be entirely canceled because the government issued a red extreme heat warning, making travel unsafe.
Canceling a climate summit because it is dangerously hot outside is the most grimly accurate metaphor for our current era. But why is Europe specifically baking so much faster than everywhere else?
The climatologists point to two primary drivers: The first is a geographic reality called polar amplification. Because the Earth is rapidly losing highly reflective polar ice, the higher latitudes of the northern hemisphere are absorbing vastly more heat than the tropics. Geographically, Europe sits closer to the warming North Pole than any other heavily populated continent.
But the second reason detailed in the report is what truly blew my mind: the clean air paradox.
Yes, it is a fascinating, deeply tragic scientific irony. For the last 4 decades, the European Union has aggressively and highly successfully regulated industrial emissions and local air pollution. They scrub the sulfur dioxide out of the air, the smog is gone, which is an incredible triumph for human lungs, reducing asthma and respiratory disease massively. But those thick atmospheric aerosol pollutants actually served a secondary purpose. They acted as a reflective shield, bouncing incoming solar radiation back into space.
It's like Europe spent a century wearing a giant, filthy pair of sunglasses. They finally clean up their act, they take the glasses off, and they realize they are staring directly into the blazing sun. By cleaning their air, they remove the particulate shield, allowing more direct sunlight to hit the surface, thereby inadvertently supercharging their own surface warming.
That's a brilliant way to visualize it. And meteorologically, this specific deadly heat wave was locked into place by an atmospheric phenomenon called an omega block.
An omega block sounds like a doomsday device from a comic book.
It acts like one. It is a massive horseshoe-shaped pattern of atmospheric pressure shaped exactly like the Greek letter omega. It features a high-pressure system trapped between two low-pressure systems. It essentially acts as an atmospheric wall, preventing any cooling cloud formation and locking a dome of stagnant, superheated air in place over Western Europe for weeks on end. And attribution scientists calculate that underlying climate change made this specific omega block event between 2 to 4 degrees hotter than an identical weather pattern would have been 50 years ago.
And the historical context of European heat waves is horrifying. The 2003 heat wave killed over 70,000 people. The 2022 heat wave killed over 60,000. The lens notes that European governments are racing to adapt their urban infrastructure, painting roofs white, planting urban canopies, establishing cooling centers, which they estimate saved roughly 40,000 lives during this recent spike. But they are desperately struggling to engineer their way out of a physics problem that is accelerating faster than they can pour concrete.
And while Europe boils, the rest of the physical world continues to generate massive shocks. The report catalogs severe tectonic earthquakes in Venezuela that caused widespread building collapses in Caracas, prompting the U.S. to set aside geopolitical animosity and deploy heavy search and rescue teams. In Sudan, the UN is issuing desperate warnings of imminent mass atrocities as the rapid support forces completely encircle the city of El Obeid. And on a totally different historical note, the report marks the definitive end of the era of traditional 20th century central banking, with the passing of former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan at the age of 100.
It is a profound, almost overwhelming amount of structural change hitting the global operating system simultaneously. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's try to synthesize this incredible journey we've just been on through the geopolitical lens. We started by looking at a remade Middle East, watching a highly pragmatic nationalist Iran decide that state survival and toll boothing the Strait of Hormuz are far more valuable than exporting religious revolution.
We saw how that pragmatic evolution exposed the deep vulnerabilities of the glittering Gulf states, forced a political and moral reckoning in Israel over the limits of military force, and incredibly managed to simultaneously spike the price of California pistachios, while Chinese electric vehicle adoption quietly depressed global oil markets in the midst of a war.
We then watched the very nature of human warfare shift beneath our feet. We are moving away from the era of exquisite billion-dollar American stealth bombers and into the era of millions of cheap, autonomous, disposable drones. We learned that the victor in the next conflict won't be the nation with the most ships, but the military that can adapt its Cold War bureaucracy to AI software updates faster than its rival.
Which logically led us into the AI supremacy race itself. We saw Chinese labs brilliantly matching Western intelligence benchmarks while bypassing hardware export controls, creating a fierce geopolitical battle over whether the developing world will operate on an AI trained on American liberal democracy or one featuring a hidden Chinese authoritarian censorship layer.
We saw Silicon Valley tech companies desperately hiring philosophers to code Kantian ethics into chatbots, while simultaneously automating away the livelihoods of highly educated Gen Z professionals, prompting economists to propose radical equity taxes and wage insurance just to prevent societal collapse. And we watched governments desperately struggle to assert control over this chaos, from banning teenagers off social media in Australia to the profound Brexit fatigue paralyzing Britain, all while the physical climate turns Europe into an oven due to the tragic irony of clean air.
It is the relentless, violent collision of all these forces, the physical geography, the digital algorithms, the economic anxiety, that definitively defines our era. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative concept to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We began this entire conversation by talking about the map and how the physical geography of the world, the mountains, the ports, the straits, used to dictate global power.
Right. The golden rule of history. Control the physical choke point. Control the world.
But consider the new reality we have just mapped out together. If our militaries are rapidly transitioning to autonomous drone swarms that make their own lethal targeting decisions based on silicon chips, and our digital social networks are governed by AI ethicists using 18th century philosophy to program exactly what billions of people see, read, and believe, well, the most vital question for the next decade isn't which nation-state has the most power.
You're saying the physical lines on the map don't matter nearly as much as the invisible lines of code.
Exactly. The ultimate question you have to ask yourself as we head into this future is this. When the machines are the ones making the micro decisions of war and peace, of economic distribution and objective truth, who or what actually holds sovereignty?
And suddenly that comforting, concrete physical map we used to rely on feels very, very obsolete. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the consensus, and keep looking beyond the headlines. So in 2026, there was this hedge fund,
Right.
built by Wall Street quantitative analysts. And they quietly took control of 11% of America's physical natural gas supply.
Which is just staggering when you really think about it.
Right. And we aren't talking about financial contracts here.
Yeah.
Or, paper derivatives traded on a screen in Manhattan.
No, they bought the actual physical gas.
Exactly. The stuff that flows through the pipes to heat your home and power your local hospital. Today, we are looking at a world where financial titans are basically acting like sovereign nations.
Yeah, and at the same time, actual sovereign nations are fighting these multi-billion-dollar wars where they are literally, and I mean literally, running out of bullets.
It's wild. Welcome to another deep dive. Today's stack of sources is a massive, incredibly dense digest called the Weekly Geopolitical Lens.
Covering the week of June 22nd to the 28th of 2026.
Right. And our mission today is to decode this totally chaotic state of the world by connecting the dots between four major pillars of global change. We're looking at the shifting architecture of the American empire.
We're looking at the weaponization of global economics, too.
Yeah, and the high-stakes physical reality of the AI revolution, and finally the deep, deep fracturing of our social fabric. But before we get into the weeds, there's a very specific ground rule we have to establish for this particular material.
Yes, absolutely. We need to be explicitly clear with you before we go any further. Because this material touches on highly polarized, intensely politically charged topics from all over the world.
From the actions of Donald Trump to Benjamin Netanyahu, Narendra Modi, the UK government, and even, debates on gender politics and the sexual revolution.
Right. So we must state unequivocally that we are not taking sides. We are impartially analyzing the arguments presented in this specific source material.
We're neither endorsing left-wing nor right-wing viewpoints here.
Exactly. Our sole objective is to unpack these ideas, lay them out on the table, and help you understand the global forces at play according to the experts in this digest.
We are just the tour guides, not the judges. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because we are going to explore how a philosophy from ancient Athens actually explains Elon Musk's fluctuating wealth.
And how a narrow stretch of water in the Middle East dictates the price you pay at the pump in Indiana, even if that oil never touches American shores.
And why the glorious AI revolution might end up looking less like a shiny tech monopoly and a lot more like the brutal, low-margin airline industry.
Which is a fascinating comparison, but to understand any of that, we have to start by rethinking what the word empire even means in the 21st century.
Because we have this historical hangover, right, where we think of empires like Rome or Britain, sending legions, conquering land, planting flags.
Extracting physical gold, yeah.
But the digest kicks off with this really fascinating interview with Herman Mark Schwartz. And he argues the United States is an empire, just not a territorial one. He calls it an empire of networks. Hold on, though. Because Schwartz is calling us an empire, but we don't have legions occupying London or Tokyo. I mean, Rome fell because the barbarians breached the physical gates.
Yeah.
If we're an empire, how does that actually function without territorial conquest.
Well, it functions through institutional chokeholds. Schwartz points out that the U.S. doesn't need to physically occupy a country to exert immense control over its behavior.
Right.
The imperial center is this vast, interconnected web of institutions that the rest of the world just voluntarily plugs into. Look at the military side, right? NATO.
For sure.
The U.S. provides the overwhelming majority of the command and control capabilities, the satellite intelligence, and the logistics. European nations maintain their sovereignty, but their defense architecture is essentially an American operating system.
An American operating system, I like that. And the economic operating system is even more pervasive, right? The global dollar system.
Exactly. The Federal Reserve acts as the central bank for the world. If a company in South Korea wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, that transaction is almost always priced and settled in U.S. dollars.
Right, passing through clearinghouses that ultimately answer to Washington.
Yeah, which gives the U.S. the power to sanction, to freeze assets, to literally cut a nation off from the global economy without firing a single shot.
And then you add international intellectual property regimes to that.
Yes. Software licensing, pharmaceutical patents, these are shaped entirely by U.S. corporate interests. And other countries' elites cooperate with this American network because participating in it offers them immense economic opportunities.
Even if it means subordinating their own geopolitical independence. So it's like the U.S. owns the internet router for the global economy.
That's a great way to put it.
They don't need to own your personal laptop. They just own the Wi-Fi password.
Yeah.
But Schwartz breaks down the costs and benefits of maintaining this network for everyday Americans.
Yeah.
And it's a brutal trade-off.
It really is. On the plus side, Americans get incredibly cheap consumer goods.
Because the dollar is strong, so importing televisions or clothing is cheap. We get relative global stability, and we maintain military dominance without the catastrophic tax hikes that a traditional occupying empire would require.
But the domestic cost is severe. To maintain the dollar's status as the global reserve currency, the U.S. has to run massive trade deficits.
And that structural reality is what hollowed out American manufacturing jobs.
Exactly. Industrial communities in the Midwest went into terminal decline because it basically became mathematically impossible to compete with foreign labor while maintaining an artificially strong imperial currency.
So the system hyper-concentrates benefits among multinational corporations, coastal financial hubs, and billionaires,
while pushing the middle class toward gig economy instability.
which introduces a massive vulnerability. Because empires rarely fall solely to external conquest, right? They usually decay from within when the elites who benefit from this system start dismantling the institutions that keep it running.
Right. And Schwartz introduces this concept of the two Trump administrations operating simultaneously to explain this internal tension.
It's a really vital framework for understanding the current executive branch. Walk us through that.
So on one hand, you have the administration driven by Trump himself. This operates primarily through personal authority, transactional decision-making, and instinct.
It's highly reactive.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily operate on a grand, structured vision of global order. It treats geopolitics like a series of isolated real estate deals.
But running parallel to that, deeply embedded in the agencies, is the Project 2025 faction.
And this faction is entirely different. It is highly organized, deeply ideological, and seeking massive, permanent structural changes.
What kind of changes?
Well, their goals include fundamentally weakening independent universities, aggressively deregulating the financial sector, and prioritizing specific corporate interests over organized labor.
And Schwartz's core argument is that this second administration is actively hollowing out the institutional knowledge, the career diplomats, the economic regulators, the scientific researchers.
The people who actually make the American empire of networks function, they are disabling the operating system from the inside.
So let's look at how that erratic restructuring, that internal tension, actually plays out on the global stage. Because if you want to see the limits of this transactional approach, you really just have to look at the Middle East.
Shashi Tharoor's piece in the Digest explains why U.S.-Iran diplomacy seems to constantly collapse, even when a deal looks logically beneficial for both sides.
He frames it as a clash of diplomatic languages.
Right. It is a structural clash of worldviews. Tharoor points out that the U.S., particularly under the current administration's transactional approach, uses what he calls the art of the deal methodology.
Which is incredibly high pressure.
Yes. It views negotiations as a zero-sum game, where one side wins and the other loses. It is obsessed with speed, personal leverage, and achieving immediate, highly visible wins that can be announced at a press conference.
It basically views diplomacy exactly like a corporate buyout. You walk into the boardroom, you slam an offer on the table, you threaten a hostile takeover if they don't sign by midnight, and you expect capitulation.
But Iran uses a completely different psychological framework. They use an institutional bazaar-style approach.
A bizarre style.
Yeah, in a bazaar, you do not walk up to a merchant and demand a final price immediately. You value extreme patience. You utilize strategic ambiguity.
So for Iran, negotiation isn't about reaching a final, clean corporate settlement that permanently resolves the tension.
Exactly. It is about establishing a long-term system of managed leverage.
So when Iran intentionally slows things down to assess their leverage or build consensus among their own hardliners, the U.S. interprets that patience as bad faith and obstruction.
And when the U.S. uses maximum pressure slapping on new sanctions mid-negotiation to force a rapid outcome, Iran sees it as unlawful coercion. They're literally speaking two incompatible languages.
And when those languages fail entirely, the result is kinetic conflict. Which brings us to Dana Stroll's analysis of the recent U.S.-Israeli war against Iran. If you just look at the raw military statistics, it sounds like absolute annihilation.
The numbers are definitely staggering.
Over 10,000 air sorties flown, 130,000 targets struck across Iranian territory and their proxy networks, 1,700 Iranian missiles and drones intercepted in the air.
And the U.S. and Israel reportedly destroyed 85% of Iran's missile and drone production facilities.
So on paper, that is a textbook military triumph.
What's fascinating here is that despite overwhelming undisputed military superiority, the war was a strategic failure for the United States.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that.
Oh.
How do you hit 130,000 targets, wipe out 85% of their production, and still fail strategically?
Because military success is measured against political objectives, not just bomb damage assessments, the stated objective, fueled by the Trump administration and Israeli leadership, was regime change.
Or at the very least, total capitulation that would permanently end Iran's nuclear and regional ambitions.
Right. But the regime in Tehran did not collapse. They did not surrender. Instead, they adapted on the ground.
They shifted the entire nature of the conflict.
They realized they could never beat American F-35 fighter jets in a traditional air war, so they leaned entirely into asymmetric warfare.
Utilizing cheap, swarming drones.
Yep. They deployed sea mines in commercial shipping lanes and used small, fast attack boats to disrupt the global economy. They forced the U.S. to play a defensive game that it could not afford to maintain.
The cost-exchange ratio here is brutal. Let's really break that down. Iran is firing off mass-produced drones that cost maybe $20,000 to $50,000 each.
And to stop those drones from hitting critical infrastructure or aircraft carriers, the U.S. is forced to fire Patriot and Thea interceptor missiles.
And a single Patriot missile costs roughly $4 million. Stroll notes the U.S. burned through over half of its entire pre-war agent inventory and nearly half his Patriot missiles.
They didn't lose the war on the battlefield. They literally started running out of the expensive bullets needed to fight the cheap ones.
Which leaves Iran standing, but at a massive crossroads. Because the digest points out that merely surviving a superpower assault is not the same as thriving.
Iran now faces a monumental choice regarding its future. Do they pursue the North Korea or Israel path of nuclear deterrence?
If they sprint to a nuclear bomb, they guarantee their regime's survival against future U.S. attacks. But they ensure total, permanent economic isolation.
Or they choose the second path, abandoning the nuclear route and focusing on economic integration. Iran has a massive human capital, a highly educated youth population, and vast natural resources.
If they integrate, they could become an economic powerhouse, but they remain vulnerable to conventional military pressure.
And while Iran wrestles with that existential choice, America's allies are watching this play out, and they are absolutely panicking.
Because the U.S. burned through its most advanced arsenal and still failed to secure a clear strategic victory.
The global trust deficit is widening rapidly.
A traditional assumption that American military might can solve any regional problem has basically been shattered.
Which is causing a seismic shift in global alliances. The U.S. has traditionally acted as the security guarantor, the ultimate umbrella.
If you are a U.S. ally, the implicit promise was that Washington would handle your existential threats.
But now, the U.S. is shifting from a guarantor to a security integrator. They want to coordinate regional security, sell weapons, and facilitate intelligence sharing, but they no longer want to provide unconditional, open-ended protection.
Which means the allies are actively hedging their bets. The digest calls it the growing rift with America.
Gulf states, traditionally heavily reliant on U.S. protection, are suddenly looking at Ukraine's defense industry.
Reaching out to NATO independently and forming new security pacts with Asian partners. They realize American protection might be conditional or simply insufficient.
But the anxiety isn't just military, it is deeply economic. Europe is terrified of American unpredictability.
The digest uses a specific example here. When Washington abruptly restricted foreign access to Anthropic's advanced AI models, Mythos 5 and Fable 5, it triggered alarms across European capitals.
Because if the U.S. can just turn off access to the foundational models of the future economy, Europe realizes it is completely vulnerable. They are effectively digital vassals.
So Europe is now pushing incredibly hard for what they call AI sovereignty.
They are subsidizing their own massive data centers and funding local open source models, so they are never entirely reliant on Silicon Valley.
And we see this protectionism everywhere. Canada is actively shielding 9 critical economic sectors, ranging from critical minerals to biomanufacturing, specifically to maintain sovereignty from U.S. pressure.
India is aggressively diversifying its defense acquisitions away from relying on any single superpower.
The digest uses a great term for this: mutual off-switches. Allies are building economic weapons to deter U.S. bullying.
If Washington threatens tariffs or tech bans, Europe wants to be able to pull the plug on ASML semiconductor technology, which the U.S. desperately needs.
India wants to be able to hold back the export of generic pharmaceuticals, which the U.S. healthcare system heavily relies on.
Canada knows it has leverage with massive potash exports that feed U.S. agriculture. It is a global web of mutually assured economic disruption. Every ally is building a panic button.
And this anxiety cascades down from the major economic blocs directly into the client state level. Look at Israel and the political mechanics of Benjamin Netanyahu.
The journalist Nadav Eyal and the Drucker critique provide a really sharp analysis of how shifting U.S. dynamics have cornered him.
Netanyahu's entire political survival relies on maintaining a state of polarization and sustaining a wartime economy that keeps emergency powers active.
But the geopolitical ground has completely shifted underneath him. He cannot run his old playbook.
Right? Because back in 2015, during the Obama administration, Netanyahu famously went around the White House, spoke directly to the U.S. Congress, and rallied intense bipartisan support to undermine the Iran nuclear deal.
Right.
He acted as an independent geopolitical force.
He cannot replicate that today for 2 reasons. First, the bipartisan consensus on Israel within the U.S. has severely fractured, particularly among younger demographics.
And second,
more importantly, Donald Trump has explicitly asserted dominance in the relationship. The transactional nature of the U.S. administration means they demand absolute loyalty.
Trump has reportedly reminded Israeli leadership directly that the U.S. funds their defense interceptors, publicly stating, "I called all the shots."
Netanyahu has been practically sidelined.
Yeah.
He is forced to stay quiet while a new U.S.-Iran peace framework is negotiated by intermediaries, because his political survival relies entirely on a U.S. administration that is increasingly hostile to his defiance.
And the irony of that new U.S.-Iran peace framework is looking at who actually stepped in to mediate it: Pakistan. The digest highlights this incredibly complex dynamic where Pakistan's army chief, General Asim Munir, essentially played shuttle diplomacy between Washington and Tehran.
Which perfectly illustrates a historical structural pattern in American foreign policy. The U.S. strongly prefers dealing with Pakistani military rulers over civilian governments.
Why is that exactly?
Because civilian governments are messy, they are constrained by parliaments, public opinion, and local elections.
Military leaders, however, can deliver strategic cooperation quickly.
Exactly. If Washington needs airspace clearance, intelligence sharing, or back-channel mediation, a general can make that happen with a single phone call without having to worry about losing a midterm election.
But elevating the Pakistani military completely infuriated New Delhi. India felt blindsided by the U.S. bringing their primary regional rival into the center of a major geopolitical negotiation.
And this has led to a severely strained relationship between the U.S. and India. Trump retaliated against India's displeasure by slapping massive 50% tariffs on Indian imports.
And the rationale behind those tariffs highlights the transactional chaos we discussed earlier. It was reportedly driven by personal grievance after Modi refused to nominate Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize.
It's incredible theater. You have this performative strongman rapport between Trump and Modi on camera.
Yeah, they host massive rallies together holding hands.
But behind the scenes, there is a fierce tariff war and deep geopolitical friction over defense ties.
Which forces us to ask a fundamental question about the nature of power today. If overwhelming military superiority couldn't achieve U.S. goals in Iran, and tariffs are being thrown around as personal diplomatic weapons against India, what is the actual nature of modern warfare?
The Digest argues that we have to update Karl von Clausewitz for the 21st century. Clausewitz famously said that war is the continuation of politics by other means.
But the modern reality is that war is the continuation of economic competition.
Military power might determine if a nation survives an attack today, but economic power determines if it has the industrial capacity, the supply chains, and the resources to actually fight tomorrow.
And nothing illustrates the fragile nature of that economic power better than the vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz. Daniel Yergin's piece in the Digest unpacks the mechanics of this beautifully.
We saw a conflict halfway across the world, and suddenly U.S. gas prices jumped to $4.50 a gallon.
Let's pause on that mechanism for a second, because this confuses a lot of people. The United States is currently the world's largest oil producer. We pump more oil out of the ground than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia.
Right.
So how does a conflict in the Middle East dictate the price a consumer pays at a gas station in Indiana? If we make our own oil, why do we care if a ship gets blocked in the Persian Gulf?
Because energy isn't isolated. It is a globally integrated market. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow choke point between Oman and Iran that handles roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil.
And when Iran deployed cheap sea mines and drone swarms in that strait, they didn't just block oil headed to the U.S., they blocked oil headed everywhere.
Suddenly, a massive chunk of the total global supply was cast into doubt.
So international buyers in Japan, South Korea, and Europe start panicking. They still need oil to run their economies, so they start aggressively bidding up the price for whatever oil is still available on the open market.
Exactly. And U.S. oil producers are private companies. If a barrel of oil is suddenly worth $20 more on the global market because of a shortage in Asia, the U.S. producer is going to sell it at that higher global price.
U.S. consumers are forced to compete with panicked global buyers, even for domestic oil.
The cascading effects of that choke point were severe. Asian countries had to implement fuel rationing. Europe saw commercial flights grounded because jet fuel became prohibitively expensive overnight.
And it laid bare a harsh reality about the green transition. The assumption was that moving to electric vehicles would isolate the West from these Middle Eastern oil shocks.
But the EV transition is still way too slow, the grid infrastructure isn't there, and crucially, the EV supply chain itself is heavily dominated by China.
We just traded reliance on one geographic choke point for another.
And while nation-states are busy fighting over these physical choke points, the financial sector has realized where the true power lies. The financial titans are quietly moving in to own the physical resources themselves.
This is where the story of Citadel Commodities comes in, and it represents a profound shift in modern capitalism.
Citadel is a massive hedge fund run by Ken Griffin.
Right, and the Digest notes that he built their commodities arm from the ashes of the Enron collapse. When Enron went bankrupt, Griffin poached their brilliant quantitative analysts.
The mathematicians who build algorithms to predict energy flows.
For a long time, hedge funds like Citadel just traded paper. They traded financial contracts, futures, and derivatives based on the price of oil or gas.
They were betting on the weather, essentially. But after the 2008 financial crisis, massive new regulations forced traditional Wall Street banks to back away from trading physical commodities because of the systemic risk.
And Citadel stepped right into that regulatory void.
And they didn't just step into trade paper, they bought the pipe.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They transitioned from financial speculation to owning the actual physical assets that run the country.
Through subsidiaries, Citadel acquired 57,000 acres in the Haynesville Shale Basin. They operate 14 active drilling rigs.
By 2025, they were physically handling 11% of all U.S. natural gas consumption.
You have a hedge fund leveraging 17 terabytes of daily satellite and weather data, running complex AI algorithms to dictate the physical flow of energy across the continent.
It's an incredible story of scale, but the danger here is immense. I mean, is it dangerous for a hedge fund to essentially run a massive chunk of a nation's physical infrastructure?
Absolutely.
You have an entity whose foundational DNA is designed purely for cyclical, aggressive financial speculation. Their mandate is to maximize profit for their investors, not to ensure public utility stability.
It is like letting a casino operate a city's water supply.
Right. It's a casino running the water supply, where the casino's algorithms are trained to shut off the water valves if the house starts losing money on a bad derivative bet.
The reputational and political peril here is enormous. If there is a massive grid failure in the winter or a catastrophic price spike, the public outrage won't be directed at a slow-moving, regulated utility company.
It will be directed at a shadowy hedge fund in Chicago.
But this corporate control of resources is just one facet of the new economic warfare. The digest also details how state actors use macroeconomics as a weapon, specifically looking at China's currency strategy.
Brad Setzer and Shaheen Valet wrote a piece on China's currency manipulation that completely upends how we talk about trade wars.
We constantly hear politicians talk about tariffs, slapping a 25% tax on Chinese goods to protect American jobs.
But Setzer and Valet argue that these tariffs are essentially useless against the current strategy coming out of Beijing.
Because tariffs only address the symptom at the border. They don't address the structural machinery of the Chinese economy.
To understand this, you have to look back at the massive Chinese property crisis in 2021.
Real estate was the engine of Chinese wealth. And when it collapsed, domestic consumer demand within China cratered. Chinese citizens stopped spending money.
So to save their economy from a depression, Beijing shifted their entire economic machinery toward export-led growth. They decided to manufacture their way out of the crisis by flooding the world with goods.
But to supercharge those exports and make sure people actually buy them, you have to manipulate the price.
Right, and you do that by deliberately undervaluing your currency, the renminbi.
The People's Bank of China intervenes in global currency markets, essentially keeping the value of their money artificially low compared to the US dollar.
Walk through what that actually means for a physical product.
Let's say a factory in Guangzhou manufactures a t-shirt. Because the renminbi is kept artificially cheap, that t-shirt costs almost nothing when priced in US dollars.
It floods the American market, undercutting any domestic manufacturer.
Conversely, because the renminbi is weak, it is incredibly expensive for a Chinese citizen to buy an imported American product.
So it creates a one-way street of trade.
Exactly. And when the US tries to stop this by putting a tariff on goods shipped directly from China, Beijing simply reshuffles the supply chain.
That same factory in Guangzhou ships the raw components of the t-shirt or the solar panel or the EV battery across the border to Vietnam or Mexico.
It gets assembled there, slapped with a Made in Vietnam label, and shipped to the US, completely bypassing the tariff.
This systemic manipulation created a staggering $1.5 trillion Asian trade surplus.
Setzer and Valet argue that until international bodies like the G7 and the IMF force China to appreciate its currency, to let the market dictate the value of the renminbi, global trade imbalances will keep spiraling.
And the tariff whack-a-mole game will achieve nothing. And this economic warfare isn't just about factory jobs. It directly connects to the physical, existential threat against Taiwan, which Richard Haass and David Sachs analyze in the digest.
The constant question in geopolitics is, when is Xi Jinping going to militarily launch an amphibious invasion of Taiwan?
But Haass and Sachs argue that Xi doesn't actually want or necessarily need a D-Day-style military invasion.
An invasion across the Taiwan Strait is incredibly risky. The amphibious logistics are a nightmare. It could trigger a global economic depression, invite direct U.S. military intervention, and inevitably destroy the very semiconductor infrastructure China wants to capture.
Why destroy the prize you are trying to win?
Instead, Xi's strategy is psychological coercion backed by economic isolation.
It's an anaconda strategy. You slowly squeeze the prey until it stops fighting.
Yes. China surrounds Taiwan with constant military drills that simulate blockades, they restrict trade, and crucially, they exploit any wavering or hesitation from the U.S. administration.
If the U.S. looks unpredictable, if the U.S. is fighting tariff wars with its own allies, Xi wants to convince the Taiwanese population that American rescue is a fantasy.
He wants to create a sense of psychological inevitability. If the Taiwanese people believe resistance is futile, they might elect a government that gradually accommodates Beijing politically, allowing China to absorb Taiwan without firing a single shot.
The stakes of that absorption couldn't be higher. If Taiwan falls under Beijing's control, the geopolitical map shatters. China breaks out of the first island chain, allowing them to project naval submarine power deep into the Pacific, directly threatening Japan and the Philippines.
But even more critically for your everyday life, they gain absolute control over the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing facilities on the planet.
Which acts as the perfect bridge to our next major theme. If semiconductors are the geopolitical prize of the 21st century, artificial intelligence is the high-stakes game those chips are being used to play.
We absolutely have to talk about the AI economy. The sheer scale of the money moving in this space is difficult to comprehend.
The digest notes that tech hyperscalers, Companies like Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, and Alphabet are projected to spend $5 trillion on compute by 2030. Let's pause and visualize what compute actually means, because it's not just a software program on a laptop.
Compute refers to the massive physical infrastructure required to train and run these artificial intelligence models. We are talking about data centers the size of several football fields.
Packed floor to ceiling with specialized, incredibly expensive GPUs, graphics processing units.
These facilities require massive industrial liquid cooling systems so the servers don't literally melt. They require their own dedicated power substations because they draw as much electricity as a medium-sized city.
That is compute.
Yeah.
It is a massive physical footprint, and the revenue expectations driving this build-out are astronomical. Anthropic, one of the leading AI labs, hit a revenue run rate of $47 billion.
A run rate basically means if you take their current monthly revenue and project it out over a year, they are operating at a $47 billion scale.
The assumption from Wall Street is that because these companies are spending trillions on infrastructure, they will automatically achieve massive high-margin monopolies. They expect the AI boom to look like the creation of the Google search engine or the Apple App Store.
A toll booth on the internet where the company has a license to print money.
But the digest offers a fascinating, highly contrarian perspective. It proposes the airline analogy for large language models, or LLMs.
Think about the commercial airline industry. Airlines use incredibly advanced, miraculous technology to fly metal tubes through the sky. It requires massive ongoing capital expenditure to buy the planes.
But historically, airlines are a brutal, low-margin bloodbath of a business.
Because at the end of the day, everyone is essentially offering the exact same commoditized product. A cramped seat from point A to point B. You don't care if it's a Boeing or an Airbus, you just want the cheapest ticket to Chicago.
Exactly. And with AI, all these major tech hyperscalers are building the exact same foundational models.
They are all using the same basic architecture, scraping the same internet data, and utilizing the same scaling approach. They are commoditizing intelligence.
And unlike a railroad or a fiber optic cable network where you lay the track once and collect rent for 50 years, AI hardware depreciates incredibly fast.
You buy $1 billion worth of cutting-edge NVIDIA chips today, and in 36 months, they are functionally obsolete because a faster generation has been released.
So you have massive constant capital expenditure, you have intense price wars because all the models do roughly the same thing, and on top of that, the product is still flawed.
These massive LLMs still hallucinate. They confidently invent facts and make reasoning errors, so they require expensive human oversight.
Rapid hardware depreciation, fierce price competition, high operating costs. That is an airline. That is not a high-margin monopoly.
And this rapid expansion is hitting a massive physical wall. The digest points out that the biggest bottleneck constraining AI development isn't data anymore, it's electricity.
The power grids in the United States cannot handle the demand. We are seeing companies like Anthropic having to pivot their infrastructure investments to places like Australia and Japan.
They are desperately hunting for stable electrical grids, abundant renewable energy, and political stability away from the volatility of U.S. domestic politics.
But they aren't just fighting for electricity. They are fighting off intellectual theft on an industrial scale. The digest details an unprecedented extraction attack by Alibaba against Anthropic's Claude models.
This is a fascinating look at how corporate espionage works in the AI age.
Alibaba essentially used 25,000 fake accounts to generate nearly 29 million automated exchanges to illegally distill the Claude model. Break down what distillation means in this context.
Let's use an analogy. Training a massive AI model from scratch is like sending a student to medical school. It takes billions of dollars, immense supercomputing time, and years of trial and error to learn the underlying patterns of knowledge.
But distillation is a shortcut.
Right. If you already have a weaker, cheaper AI model, you can rapidly improve it by forcing it to study the answers generated by a superior model, like Anthropic's Claude.
You use the genius student to tutor the mediocre student.
Exactly. By using fake accounts to automatically query Claude 29 million times, Alibaba was extracting the refined, high-quality logic that Anthropic spent billions of dollars to develop.
They were feeding those perfect answers into their own inferior system to train it on the cheap.
It is the digital equivalent of stealing the blueprints to a proprietary engine. It is state-level intellectual property theft.
Which is exactly why the U.S. Department of Commerce had to step in and aggressively restrict Anthropic's models globally. So you have this high-level reality where tech titans are fighting over national power grids and fending off state-sponsored espionage.
But zoom out from Silicon Valley for a minute.
Average workers are sitting at their kitchen tables, terrified of what this technology means for their daily livelihoods.
Jacob Leibenluft's piece in the Digest tackles the human toll of AI, and he highlights a fascinating psychological split.
Global polling shows Americans are significantly more fearful of AI job displacement than people in developing nations.
It directly reflects the fragility of the American social safety net. In many developing nations with large informal economies, a new technology like AI is often viewed as a tool for upward mobility.
A way to bypass traditional gatekeepers.
But in the United States, your entire socioeconomic standing and, crucially, your family's health care is tied directly to your employer.
If a 45-year-old accountant in Ohio loses their job to an algorithm, they don't just lose their paycheck. They lose their health insurance. They lose the ability to pay their mortgage. The floor completely drops out.
In countries like Germany or Japan, healthcare is largely decoupled from your specific boss. The anxiety is lower.
But for an American worker, AI is terrifying because it threatens to pull the rug out from under their life overnight.
Leibenluft points out that historically, the U.S. government is terrible at protecting workers from technological shifts. Look at the Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TAA, program.
This was the program designed to help factory workers who lost their jobs to globalization and foreign imports in the 90s and 2000s.
And it was a bureaucratic nightmare. The burden of proof was entirely on the displaced worker.
You had to navigate a maze of federal paperwork to definitively prove that your specific factory job was eliminated specifically because of a foreign import, rather than just general economic downturn.
The Digest notes that in its first 7 years, not a single application in certain sectors was approved. It was too narrow, too slow, and too confusing for someone who was just trying to figure out how to feed their kids.
Which is why Leibenluft argues that if we want to survive the AI wave without massive social unrest, the government must adopt presumptive eligibility. Explain the mechanics of that.
Presumptive eligibility flips the burden of proof. You don't wait until 3 million coders or paralegals are laid off and then ask them to fill out forms proving an AI took their job.
You assume massive displacement is coming across certain sectors, and you start providing broad, immediate income protection and retraining before the mass layoffs happen.
The government doesn't care why you lost your job. They just acknowledge that the labor market is in structural upheaval, and they provide a universal safety net to catch you.
But the incredible irony of this widespread panic is that right now, AI is largely failing to deliver results in the corporate world.
Ravi Kumar S. and Julia Averill wrote a piece highlighting what they call the AI velocity gap.
The foundational models are advancing at breakneck speed in the labs, but when you look at actual businesses, 80% of organizations report absolutely zero measurable productivity impact from deploying AI.
Because corporate executives are treating AI like a standard software update. They think they can buy a generic enterprise AI model, plug it into their existing workforce, and automatically see a 20% boost in revenue.
But Averill makes a crucial point. Technology does not transform companies. People do. AI doesn't fix a broken company culture. It acts as a massive magnifying glass.
If your teams operate in silos, if managers don't trust their employees, and if communication is toxic, AI is just going to automate and accelerate your organizational dysfunction.
We see this constantly. A company deploys an AI tool to summarize meetings, but because the internal culture is highly political and people are afraid to speak honestly on the record, the meetings are useless anyway.
The AI just generates highly efficient summaries of useless meetings.
Success in the AI economy requires immense human leadership. You have to reorganize the actual human workflows, redesign incentives, and build trust so employees aren't terrified that the tool they are training is going to replace them.
And because that leadership is largely absent, we're seeing a massive cultural pushback against the tech industry, particularly from the youth.
The Digest highlights that young people are actively rejecting the utopian hype of Silicon Valley. They are booing tech CEOs, giving commencement speeches at graduations. They're building what are called cyberdecks.
Cyberdecks are fascinating. They are these homemade, offline computers built from salvaged parts, mechanical keyboards, and small screens. They are intentionally disconnected from the cloud.
It's important to clarify that this isn't Luddism. These kids aren't afraid of technology. They are incredibly technically literate.
Exactly the opposite of Luddism. This is a demand for ethical tech deployment. The youth are protesting the reckless, hyper-capitalist rollout of algorithms that perpetuate systemic biases.
They are looking at AI models used for hiring that actively screen out female candidates because they were trained on historical data of male executives.
They are looking at healthcare algorithms trained purely on white male data that fail to diagnose minority patients accurately.
The youth recognize that they are the ones who have to live in the society these tools are building. They are demanding a seat at the table to dictate how these tools function, rather than just accepting whatever the hyperscalers release.
And the failure of our institutions to give everyday people a seat at the table is causing the social fabric to stretch to its absolute breaking point.
This brings us to the final major theme of the digest: the social fallout of inequality, institutional instability, and how we are reevaluating our past. Let's start at the very top of the economic pyramid with Elon Musk.
The digest notes a moment where market volatility pushed his wealth over the trillion-dollar mark, making him the world's first trillionaire before a market correction dropped his net worth down to a mere $970 billion.
It is a staggering concentration of wealth that the human brain struggles to comprehend. At $1 trillion, his personal wealth accounted for over 3% of the entire U.S. gross domestic product.
It is a fortune 5 million times larger than the average American family's net worth.
To contextualize why that level of disparity is so dangerous, the digest reaches back to ancient wisdom, Plato's laws.
Plato argued that for a republic to survive, to avoid descending into civil war, there had to be a strict mathematical cap on wealth. He proposed a 4-to-1 ratio.
No citizen should be allowed to possess more than 4 times the wealth of the poorest citizen.
Plato wasn't just throwing numbers out. He had witnessed the city-state of Athens tear itself apart in brutal class-based civil wars.
He believed that extreme inequality inevitably splits a nation into 2 warring states, occupying the same territory: the city of the rich and the city of the poor.
He diagnosed the psychological drive behind this extreme hoarding of wealth as a disease called pleonexia, which translates to insatiable greed.
He used the physical metaphor of the leaky jug.
Yes. Plato compared a person consumed by pleonexia to a leaky vessel. No matter how much water or wealth or power you pour into it, the vessel constantly drains. It demands more. It can never be filled.
Plato argued that a leader or a citizen enslaved to this infinite leaky desire becomes a terrible judge of truth and justice.
They will always warp the laws of the society to feed their own insatiable desires, sacrificing the well-being of the republic in the process.
While enforcing a 4-to-1 wealth ratio is obviously impossible in a modern global economy, the underlying anxiety around this massive disparity is bleeding directly into global political instability. Look at the institutional decay in the United Kingdom.
The digest highlights that Prime Minister Keir Starmer is facing collapse after barely 2 years in office. Britain is currently on track to see its 7th Prime Minister in a decade.
It is a self-reinforcing cycle of institutional panic. The traditional 2-party system in the UK has fundamentally fractured.
Voters are economically anxious and highly volatile, scattering their votes to the Green Party, to the Populist Reform Party, and to regional factions.
Because voters no longer have deep party loyalty, members of parliament are terrified. A backbench MP looks at a bad polling cycle and realizes they are going to lose their job.
To save themselves, they panic and preemptively oust their own party leader, whether it was Theresa May, Liz Truss, or now Starmer, hoping a new face will magically fix the polls.
But changing the face at the top doesn't fix the underlying economic reality driving the voter anger. And that reality is Brexit.
The long-term macroeconomic analyses are firmly established in 2026, and Brexit has permanently shrunk the UK economy by 6 to 8% compared to the trajectory they were on if they had stayed in the European Union.
It serves as a stark empirical warning against the wishful thinking of protectionist populism. Erecting massive trade and regulatory barriers with your closest geographic and economic neighbors has real, permanent, compounding costs.
And this kind of ideological blindness, refusing to see the flaws in your own economic theory, isn't unique to the UK. The digest compares the Brexit fallout to Alan Greenspan's shocking admission back in 2008.
The former chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
He sat before a congressional committee after the global financial collapse and admitted that his lifelong, Ayn Rand-inspired, pure free market ideology had a fundamental flaw.
He was in a state of shocked disbelief that the self-interest of lending institutions didn't naturally prevent them from self-destructing.
He relied on mathematical models that assumed bankers would regulate themselves. He ignored the glaring housing bubble, and his ideological rigidity brought down the global economy.
And we see this systemic instability and institutional decay playing out globally. Look at Turkey.
Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been in power for 23 years, constantly maneuvering, jailing opponents, and changing the constitution to extend his rule.
But the digest notes he is finally running out of tricks. Decades of unorthodox economic mismanagement have resulted in rampant, crushing inflation.
The Turkish lira has collapsed, and a unified political opposition is finally cornering him because citizens can no longer afford basic groceries.
In India, you have a vastly different but equally complex dynamic with Narendra Modi. The digest presents a highly nuanced view here.
On one hand, Modi's administration has undeniably lifted hundreds of millions of people out of crushing poverty, modernized the digital economy, and built massive infrastructure.
But the cost has been a severe democratic backsliding. The journalist Tavleen Singh points to the NewsClick case as a prime example.
It is a textbook case of institutional weaponization. NewsClick was an independent media portal critical of the government.
The state utilized draconian anti-terror laws to raid their offices and jail journalists without trial.
The courts eventually had to step in and call the arrests a gross abuse of the law, but the chilling effect was already achieved.
International watchdogs are now classifying India as an electoral autocracy because the mechanisms of the state are routinely used to suppress political dissent and muzzle the press.
This fragmentation, this institutional decay, this extreme polarization, it isn't just happening in distant parliaments and macroeconomic charts. It is seeping directly into our daily lives.
It is fracturing our entertainment, and it is fracturing our most intimate interpersonal relationships.
Let's look at the living room first. The digest briefly touches on the final death throes of the golden cable TV model. For decades, we complained about paying a fat monthly fee for a bundle of channels, but it was a unified cultural experience.
Netflix disrupted that. But look where we are now. The streaming landscape is a fragmented, user-hostile mess.
Because the underlying economics of streaming are fundamentally worse than cable. Streaming generates far less profit per user.
So these legacy media companies are panicking. They are desperately overpaying for massive corporate mergers like Paramount Skydance buying Warner Bros. Discovery just to acquire enough raw scale to survive against tech giants like Apple and Amazon.
But for the viewer at home, it is a nightmare. You are juggling 6 different subscriptions, navigating terrible user interfaces, and paying more than you ever did for cable, while the industry itself steadily loses the attention economy to YouTube creators and short-form TikTok microdramas.
It is a fragmented, exhausting consumer experience.
So what does this all mean? Which brings us to the most human element of the digest. If our global economies are fracturing, our political institutions are decaying, and our media consumption is fragmented, it makes absolute sense that our interpersonal relationships are fracturing as well.
The digest unpacks this through Louise Perry's reactionary feminist critique of the sexual revolution.
This is a deeply provocative analysis that requires careful unpacking. Perry argues that while the sexual revolution driven by the advent of the birth control pill and a massive cultural push for liberation brought absolutely vital economic, legal, and bodily freedoms for women, it fundamentally altered societal expectations around sex in a way that ultimately inflicts a heavier cost on women than men.
To understand Perry's argument, you have to look at the biological asymmetry of sex. Perry argues that the cultural shift toward normalizing hookup culture and casual sex inherently benefits men more, on average.
This is because women bear the overwhelming biological risks of pregnancy, disproportionate physical vulnerability, and often a heavier psychological toll from transient intimacy.
By making casual sex the default cultural norm, the sexual revolution inadvertently stripped away the traditional social scripts and boundaries that historically demanded commitment and protected women from those asymmetrical risks.
The result of this cultural shift is a phenomenon Perry calls heteropessimism. It is this growing, pervasive despair, particularly among young women, about the very possibility of finding a functional, egalitarian, heterosexual relationship.
And this despair is driving extreme cultural reactions on both ends of the spectrum. On one side, you have the rise of the trad wife movement on social media, where young women are glorifying and aesthetically returning to 1950s domesticity.
They are trying to escape the exhausting chaos of modern dating by opting out entirely and returning to strict traditional gender roles.
And on the other side of that same coin, the digital revolution is driving a massive wedge between the sexes. As progressive young women express this heteropessimism, many young men feel alienated and are retreating into highly conservative, reactionary manosphere spaces online.
The internet has completely supercharged this alienation. It takes private, intimate conflicts between men and women, exposes them publicly, and monetizes the ideological polarization.
Algorithms feed outrage, convincing young men and women that the other gender is entirely hostile.
It is crucial to note that Perry's proposed solution is not a literal return to the 1950s. She does not advocate for undoing feminism or stripping away women's economic and legal rights. She strongly supports equality.
Her argument is about cultural rebalancing. She advocates for a society that acknowledges biological realities rather than ignoring them.
She suggests that we need to culturally treat sex as a profound act with serious emotional and physical consequences, rather than a casual transaction.
Her thesis is that prioritizing long-term commitment, mutual obligation, and stable family formation will provide an anchor in a society that currently feels like it is spinning out of control in endless, casual churn.
It is about finding a sense of permanence in a world where the map is constantly being erased and redrawn. And that brings us to the end of our journey today. We have covered an incredible amount of ground.
We started by examining the structural cracks in the American network empire, watching its military limitations exposed by cheap drones in the Middle East, while its global allies panic and build economic panic buttons.
We traced how global physical choke points, like the Strait of Hormuz, dictate our local gas prices, while financial hedge funds buy up our physical resources and state actors wage war through deliberate currency manipulation.
We navigated the multi-trillion-dollar gamble of the AI boom, breaking down the brutal reality of hardware depreciation, state-level intellectual extraction attacks, and the desperate need for human leadership to prevent a massive societal crisis over job displacement.
And finally, we brought it all home, looking at how the extreme concentration of wealth, rigid political ideologies, and cultural fragmentation are breaking down our institutions, our media, and the fundamental ways we relate to one another.
It is a vast, deeply interconnected web of change. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We talked earlier about Plato's concept of plenexia, the leaky jug of insatiable greed.
We usually apply that critique to billionaires like Elon Musk, pointing at their unimaginable wealth and saying they have the disease.
But I want you to consider this. What if our entire modern civilization has become the leaky jug? From our endless, ravenous demand for electrical power to run AI server farms, to our fragmented demand for infinite streaming content, all the way down to our swipe-based dating apps that promise a slightly better match is just one more click away.
Are we culturally addicted to limitless consumption at the cost of our own stability?
If the modern economy is designed to never stop pouring water into a vessel that can never be filled, what is your personal off switch?
A heavy but absolutely necessary question for the times we are living in. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the map, look for the mechanisms behind the headlines, and keep examining the forces shaping your world. We'll see you next time.